started talking about relationship. And we started talking about the relationship with God being the most important relationship that kind of gives power to everything else we do, right? It defines who we are. So in that, we came before God and we prayed. Like talking about an intimate and active prayer life. An intimate and active prayer life. And those words have been repeated throughout the last 5 weeks, right? Over the last month. Intimate and active relationship with God. It's what we're being drawn into by the very nature of who we are as created sons and daughters of God, as baptized sons and daughters of God. Right? As we continued, we went to our identity. Our identity that's been given to us by baptism. By the very act of being baptized, we were given the identity of priest, prophet, and king. Someone who sanctifies, prophet, someone who proclaims, and king as a shepherd, someone who's called to serve our brothers and sisters. And last week we talked about very, very practical ways that we can do all of those things. Very practical ways that we can live that out in the different, realms of life, right? In family, in our workplace, through our discernment. So in all of those areas of life, in the culture at large, kind of seeing how does this practically look, right? It's not going to be a top-down thing. It's not going to be a thing that we're going to look at the world and we're going to change the big pieces, but we're going to change from kind of a grassroots, right? If we're living out our baptismal call better, more perfectly in line with the church envisions, more perfectly in line with God himself envisions, then it's going to be a kind of a grassroots transformation. But it's going to be one that lasts. And it's going to be one that has a real big effect on the world around us. But tonight, we're going to talk about the liturgy. And one of the things about the liturgy is that we started off this summer, this series, we started it off by talking about how the layperson's role is supposed to be a secular role. It's supposed to be a role that's out in the world, in kind of the trenches, right? In the office building, in the classroom, right? If you're a garbage man, be a holy garbage man. If you're a lawyer, be a holy lawyer. If you're a CEO of a company to the janitor, everyone that's Catholic is supposed to be living out in the culture and transforming their little slice by their witness, right? So, I started that off, and I was kind of negative about the liturgy because the layperson, a lot of us think like the layperson's action and activity in the church is like being a Eucharistic minister, or singing in the choir, or being an usher. Like those are all things that are good, but those aren't the things that are proper to the lay vocation. But tonight we're going to talk about how is it that when we come into the building of the church, most people come into the building of the church once a week for an hour for Mass. And you can ask any priest, if you go over that hour, they're in trouble, right? But for that hour every week, how is it that how the lay person is supposed to approach the holy sacrifice of the Mass, right? To do that, we have to begin by talking about the nature of worship. Like, what is it? Like, we as human beings, there's something innate in us that we know we're called and we're made to worship, right? So when we look at the reading that I just read, right? It's the first commandment. Exodus 20, the first commandment. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall not have other gods besides me. I am a jealous God. I'm a God that you owe your worship to. If you think about that, like from the Old Testament, from the very beginning of a relationship with God, through Moses, we're hearing Yahweh, God, right, the Lord, talking to his people and saying, it's me that you're supposed to worship. You're called and you're created to worship me. Like Adam in the garden was created to be in communion with God. And at original sin, that was broken. So there's this, on this side of the fall, on this side of Eden, we're called in a particular way to offer worship to God. Like, we as human beings, we're created with the infinite in mind. Like, those questions of people asking, like, kind of like trying to act like these gurus and things of like, what is the meaning of life, right? Like, are these like kind of goofy questions that people ask, these very like big questions? It's because there's a deep sense in the heart of every human being for the infinite. There's a deep longing for something much bigger than us, much bigger than the world. Now, like, popular atheism wants to say, no, the world's the only thing. So what they're doing is they're basically just saying, no, quit asking those stupid questions. But we can answer those questions. Like, those questions are logical. They're questions that we're supposed to answer. There's questions that we're supposed to handle, because those questions, the answers lie in God. They lie in the infinite. They lie beyond our world here. Like, by trying to negate a world beyond our physical world, basically it makes the Eucharist incomprehensible. It makes things like the sacraments incomprehensible. It makes heaven seem like just an idea, a thought that, okay, that was a good idea, but it's gone now. A theory, and that's about it. But we know and we feel this longing that's beyond us, right? That longing has been put in, like, by God's design in creation from Adam and Eve after the fall, and we see it coming up again in things as explicit as the Ten Commandments. The church continues to echo that kind of teaching in two verses in the Catechism in particular. Two paragraphs. One of them, a piece of it, it says in paragraph 2084, it said God's first call and just demand. So his first, like, kind of ordinance and just command, right? So it's first and just, is that man accept him and worship him. So the first thing God asks of us is for worship. Like, the first thing that God asks whenever we have a relationship with him is worship. The first thing that he asks when we meet him is that we fall on our knees before the infinite God that we've just met. Before the one that is bigger than all, like anything that we can consciously think about. Right? Our first meeting inspires a sense of worship. The next paragraph, a couple of paragraphs later in the Catechism, in 2097, it says, the worship of the one God sets man free from turning in on himself from the slavery of sin and the idolatry of the world. We as human beings are communal. Right? We as human beings, we have this sense of being outward. Like, we have a sense of wanting to share our hearts, share our lives. In marriage, we want to share our bodies. And we have this sense of wanting to share, of wanting to give as human beings. There's a sense of selflessness that is kind of innate in a human being. The same way that concept of the infinite is, there's a sense of wanting to give. That's like kind of in the fabric of a human being. What we're saying is that worshiping God continues to orient us outward. Because when we orient ourselves inward and we close in on ourselves, that's where sin lies. That's where selfless becomes selfish. That's where giving becomes taking. Like, this is the place with, like, this is where sin really enters the picture. We look at Adam and Eve, for example. Their relationship in Eden, we don't know how long it was, but it's a relationship of giving. It's a relationship that's completely and totally entrusted to the other. It's completely oriented towards, like, Adam is completely oriented to Eve, Eve is completely oriented to Adam. The second that they fall out of right worship, out of right relationship with God, it turns in on himself. Shame enters the picture. I can't look at you, you can't look at me. Fear enters this relationship. So, like, there's this sense that you see when we're in right relationship with God, that sense of wanting to give, that sense of being oriented towards the other, is something that's like it's something that's tangible. It's something that we can taste. But those times whenever we cut that, when we cut that worship, when we ignore the infinite and we just sit here and focus just on myself, we close in on ourselves. We close in on ourselves. And that's when sin starts to abound. That's when guilt starts to abound. That's when shame starts to come up. And that's not the life that God designed for human beings. Right? This activity, though, there's an activity that it takes. Like this sense of being outward keeps us oriented towards the true God. But the sense of being inward, we kind of build up our lives around these, what we'll use, the term we'll use is idols. Right? We build up, if you look at like Israel walking through the desert, right? They were oriented towards God. They were focused on God. And then they would fall away and then they would worship an idol of the people where they were. And then they would travel a little bit more. God would kind of give them like the knock on the head, stop it. They would get back in right relationship. Then they'd keep going. So like you got golden calves. You got the different deities like Baal and all these other things that they're sacrificing. They're giving sacrifices to these idols, these empty images. Right? So it's kind of a caricature of the turning in on themselves. So I'm going to show a video. Hopefully it doesn't rub too many people the wrong way. But it's a good one, and we'll discuss it. Because one of the things that human beings, like I said, human beings are built for worship. We're going to worship. We're going to give ourselves to something. The question is, what do we give ourselves to?
I was watching TV the other day, and this show comes on with these religious fanatics. They were crazy. Well, you would think they were crazy if you didn't understand their culture and their religion. See, that's just the thing. They were worshipers of idols, and they took things to extremes. They painted their bodies. They wore these ridiculous costumes. They chanted, they danced, they made sacrifices to their idols. They had built these enormous temples to worship their idols in. It seemed like their entire existence climaxed into this one scenario, this one over-the-top act of worship. You don't really relate, do you? Let's try it again. I was watching TV the other day, and this show comes on with these religious fanatics. They were crazy. See, that's just the thing. They were worshipers of idols, and they took things to extremes. They painted their bodies. They wore these ridiculous costumes. They chanted, they danced, they made sacrifices to their idols. They had built these enormous temples to worship their idols in. It seemed like their entire existence climaxed into this one scenario, this one over-the-top act of worship. Idol worship. It's not just about golden calves anymore.
Of all people, I had the nerve to play something like that. Because I think when I was going through the list, I'm like, they painted their faces, they danced, they dressed up in these ridiculous costumes. All those things at times, like I know, like purple and gold, I was all about it. But one of the things that he says that's in particular is, and I know we see it very, very obvious, like very obviously in our culture at times, and I'll be a little bit transparent on that too, is the amount that we invest in something as stupid as a sport, in something as stupid as a college sport. And the reason why I say that, like I know for me, when I was a student and LSU lost a game, do not talk to me until Wednesday. Like seriously, and it was like, seriously, don't come around me, don't talk to me, I'm an unpleasant person. Now thank God that the seminary has kind of brought me out and helped to form me in that. But it's something that's very true, is that what do we, like, we're going to worship something. Like look at our culture. It's very, in a real way, it's sad that something as good as like sport and being a fan and being able to watch a game turns into something as addicting as like manic depression for a couple of days afterwards, right? Or something like money, which has its proper place and its proper spot, turns into an addiction of like I'm gonna ignore my family, and I'm gonna try and I'll stab anyone in the back that I have to get more. There was a line from one of the movies, Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, or whatever it was, and there was a line where a guy looked at him and said, "What's your number? Like, when can you get? What number do you have to get to just say, okay, I'm out? Like that you've earned enough?" And his response was, "More." It's an addiction. There's never enough. Something in our culture, an over-sexualized type culture, where physical pleasure becomes the end all, when it has its proper place, which is beautiful and holy. But when it gets taken out of that, it becomes a vice and something that's destructive. Right? When we're talking about right worship, we as human beings are going to worship something. We're going to hold something up as the infinite, whether we realize it or not. What is it that we're holding up as that infinite? What is it that we're lifting up as the kind of end all, like our purpose for life? I'm gonna say, I would guess that because we're all here, we want to uphold God as that standard. We want to uphold God, and particularly our experience of Him in the liturgy as that standard. Right? So how do we come to participate better in His liturgy? How do we come to worship better in the liturgy? Because it has to be something bigger than just being someone else that gives out communion or sings in a choir. Because that's good, but it doesn't quite echo the infinite to us, right? So active participation. This is a phrase that the church has used throughout many, many Vatican documents about how do we actively participate in the liturgy. And this comes from the Second Vatican Council's document on the laity. And it says, "This life of intimate union with Christ in the church is nourished by spiritual helps available to all the faithful, especially," so like the number one spiritual help, "by active participation in the liturgy. Lay people should so make use of these helps in such a way that while properly fulfilling their secular duties in the ordinary conditions of life, they do not disassociate union with Christ from that life." So, what is it saying? Staying in that relationship, remaining in that relationship, staying in love with God, right? In the ordinary circumstances of life. But it continues to say, so we shouldn't divorce the two. We're together in that. But it continues to say, but through the very performance of these tasks according to God's will, they may actually grow in their relationship with God. So like by being a mom and taking care of your kids and changing diapers, you could actually grow in your relationship with God. By being a lawyer and actually like defending someone right and ethically, we can grow in our relationship with God. And that can influence our relationship with God in the liturgy. When we come to the liturgy and we bring that before God, okay, I lived my life in a virtuous way. I morally lived my life. And the two, like the moral life becomes connected with the sacramental life. Like our relationship with God actually like could flow from how we're living our life morally. So that's kind of like the background. I'm going to play another video by Mark Hart.
So several months ago, my wife and I and our kids were coming out of Sunday Mass. And as we walk out, the priest, the pastor, he's standing there shaking hands, blessing babies, stuff like that. And he looks down at my youngest daughter and he looks at her and he says, "How's Mass for you today?" And she looks right back at the priest, right in the eyes. And she says, "Wow, Father, that was really boring. I mean, really, really boring." And he looked at her, and then he looked up at me, and then I looked for the escape hatch. How can I get out of here? Because there's nothing you can say. There's no like, hey, I'll put an extra 20 in the collection basket that's going to make up for that. She just destroyed his Sunday and probably a better portion of his priesthood. Now in doing this, I had to kind of laugh once we got in the car, partly because I was mortified, and I'm thinking, where else can we go to Mass around here? but also because kids are so honest. You know, they say stuff that maybe we all think, but we're really afraid to say. I was bored at Mass as a kid. You've probably been bored at Mass before. Now, if you, like me, were raised in a Catholic family, you were probably told you're not allowed to say that. There's just certain things you're not allowed to say, especially in regards to Mass. I wasn't allowed to talk about how bad the singing was. You're not supposed to say that the organ sounds like a cat getting run over by a semi. You're not supposed to say, wow, that usher really has an attitude problem. You're not supposed to point out that the little old ladies that are writing the checks and ripping the checks out of their checkbook in the middle of the homily, you're not supposed to point out they could have done that before Mass. You're not supposed to point out that you're thinking about using the kneeler to crush your brother's toes. There's certain things you're not supposed to talk about as a Catholic. I literally, as a kid, I used to sit in the pews and I'd say, is it God's plan to bore me to death? So literally, I would sit there as a kid and I'd say, why would God do it this way? Why is his plan to bore me like this? Doesn't he love me? People say God loves me. If he loves me, he wouldn't subject me to this. And he wouldn't make it a broken commandment to miss Mass. And then all of a sudden, I started to learn about the Mass. I learned about Genesis. I learned about how when God creates, he creates with purpose. And that when God creates the Sabbath, he creates this day of rest for the man and the woman and God to be one, to be intimately united. This day of rest. We're created to worship, but we're created to worship God. Now, why does God need rest? Was he just tired after he spun all the planets into existence and gave us the cosmos and the animals and the sun and the sea? No, God doesn't need rest. He's God. He's not sitting up in heaven in some lazy God recliner. He doesn't need rest. We do. We need the rest. And God loves us enough to say, it's so important that you and I stay in relationship that I'm going to set aside a whole day every week that we enter into that relationship. Because not only we need the rest, we need to worship. We're created to. It's not like you singing at Mass or me singing at Mass makes God a stronger God or a bigger God, but it helps us. That God wants to have that intimate relationship with us. When people say, oh, I don't like organized religion, they forget that the word religion, the oldest word for it, means relationship. This is how you come to know God. The God that you wonder if he's there, the God that you pray to, this is how we come to know him. The reality is that when I went to Mass, I was going because I was told to. It was an obligation. I wasn't going because I wanted to, because it was an opportunity to grow in holiness. I would see a big, huge, empty space filled with very barely alive, bored people. But see, Mass is an invitation to go deeper. Mass is an invitation to mature spiritually. Mass is an invitation to change your perspective, to look beyond what you can see to what God is really revealing. But then when you come to learn about the Mass, why we do things the way that we do them, why we do things in the order that we do them, what each of these things signifies and what it's really about. Oh wow, you start to see that God has a lot of purpose. The same way he created with purpose in Genesis, he teaches us how to worship in Exodus. He teaches Moses what he wants, what he desires for us to worship. You see, because when creation worships the Creator, everything makes sense. When creation takes created things like bread and wine and we put them before the Creator, it reminds us of who God is, but it also reminds us of who we're not, and reminds us of what God wants for us. You see, God tells us and teaches us in Exodus how to worship, and we're still doing that. We're still living out what he desires for us that we learned all the way back in the Old Testament. But the very first thing you got to understand before we say another word is that the Mass is not just a meal, and the Mass is not just a party, and the Mass is not even just family getting together to sing some songs and listen to Father. The Mass is a sacrifice.
I think I've had all those thoughts at one point or another, and I think most people have. But one thing that he said in particular, when it comes to, especially in the sense of active participation, like what I do at Mass, that doesn't really affect a God, right? That doesn't really have a big, like God is not stronger because I sang a couple of songs, or God is not all of a sudden more powerful because I responded to the prayers, or God is not all of a sudden more loving because I said like a certain prayer after like a prayer of thanksgiving or something like that. Like it's my action doesn't really affect God, so what does it matter? But I think he made a good point. He said, no, we don't do those things. We don't respond to those prayers. We don't say a prayer of thanksgiving after communion. We don't do those things for our sake. We do those things for our sake. We don't do those for God's sake. Right? We do those things so that we remind ourselves in a way that we need God. That we come to understand that our relationship with God is something important. Like when we sing the songs at Mass, when we respond to the prayers, when we say the Holy, 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 or we mispronounce the Latin, which so many people do, including myself, when we do those things and we're offering our prayers to God, not for God's sake, but for ours. We're lifting ourselves up to Him. We're not lifting Him higher. Right? We're bringing ourselves into His presence. Like, I love you so much that I'm going to speak to you. I love so much that I'm going to sing to you. I love you so much that I'm going to respond to your priest. Like, that's what active participation is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a demeanor on our part of how we enter in to the mystery. In this kind of thing, and we'll try and get through this kind of quick, there's a big difference between imitation and intimacy. When you look at the Old Testament prayer, Old Testament worship was a lot more imitation. It was a lot more, God's very distant, and the people kind of act. The way they act, the way they do their sacrifices and things, were more to a distant God as a sign of remembering or a sign of forgiveness or mercy that they're trying to seek from God. But it was a little bit more of a, God's out there and we're down here. And like we can have a relationship with them, but it's a little bit more, there's a little bit more of a distance in the Old Testament understanding of worship, right? So they had an imitation. Where it's, I try to be like God. We try to do things like God. We try to sacrifice so that God forgives, but it's because it's like what God would do. It's like God. Intimacy, though, this is more of the worship of the Mass. This is where God is immanent. God is here. God is before us. God is present. Right? The people's actions are not oriented to some far-off God, but it's oriented in growing closer in a relationship. Growing closer in a relationship as a community, growing closer in a relationship as like a nuclear family, but growing closer in a relationship personally. Like one-on-one. The God of the universe offers Himself to each individual person at the Mass. This is it, where I seek to be with God. Right? So this is what we experience as Catholics. Oftentimes our Protestant brothers and sisters are still on the level of imitation, where it's still more of this kind of distant thing. It's God and me. It's not as much of an all-encompassing, one-on-one, intimate relationship with God. And this is what our liturgy kind of gives us an opportunity to do. It opens the door for that kind of exchange to happen. In the Mass, there are two in particular spots, though, where the lay vocation is the most active. The laity are called to be the most active in the Mass. Now, oftentimes, whenever I ask that question, people, the first thing they're thinking is like, whoa, we say the readings. No. Or we receive communion. That's a big one. Not really. That's not where the laity are enlivened. That's not where you see the laity come alive and act. The two main ones, I'm going to follow a dichotomy in the church, in a lot of theological circles, of reditus and exitus. Reditus is going to God, and exitus is coming from God. So this will happen, this is language that's used a lot of times when it comes to like Trinity or Christology, where Jesus comes from the Father but then orients Himself back to the Father. So the incarnation, He comes into the world. Through the ascension, He goes back. So it's these cycles, right? Well, in a way, the lay vocation can be understood in this cycle of coming to and going out, and coming to and going out. And those two spots that we see, the coming to, we see it through the offertory, through the prayers of the faith, through the offertory and the preparation of the gifts, where the gifts are brought up, right? It's more than just a time of like the collection. It's more of a time, it's more than just having like a cool song being played that we can all kind of like reflect to or enter into and sing or whatever. It's a time where we bring our sacrifice before God. Like in the New Translation of the Mass, there's a spot that says, "Pray, my brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God the Almighty Father." And yours? Like my sacrifice and yours, the priest says. And yours, like it's just, when I first heard it, I was like, huh? Like it kind of catches your ear, but nobody, like do we really know what we mean? What is our sacrifice that we bring? Our sacrifice is everything that we've done since the last time we received the Eucharist, since the last time we came to Mass. Our sacrifice is every joy, every sorrow, every hurt, every gladness, everything that we've done in the world is what we bring before God. All of our work out in society, all of our work out in the culture, everything that we do, both within the church and out, everything we bring up the aisle with the gifts to be put on the altar and to be consecrated to God. So we collect everything at that point and bring it up and put it in the hands of the priest, who then lifts it to God. Like the bread and the wine, we have these gifts of bread and wine that come up. The bread and the wine represent everything that we put into it, every piece of ourselves that we've done. Like everything that we've done throughout the week comes up with that and is put in the priest's hands. And the priest, by his hands and by the words and the power of his ordination, sanctifies it, transforms it. Like it's a completely new thing. Like our work in the world is transformed by the hands of the priest. That's what the offertory is. That's a little bit bigger than a collection. Exitus. So that's the reditus. That's the coming to God. The exitus. It's to get out. Ita missa est. The Mass is ended. Go in peace. Get out. Go. Like we carry the exchange of the altar. We carry that sacrifice with us out. To empower us to be that salt, that light, that leaven, that soul of society that's going to go out and transform our world. It's not supposed to be something that we just, okay, yeah, we received communion, awesome. Now where are we going? Eat. Right? I know that's my first thought usually. Where I'm going next, right? Or what else do I have to do? Or what time are we supposed to be at my mom's house? Or whatever it is. We're called at that point to go out. To go share God's love, to go share God's mercy. Like, be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful. Go in peace. Like, take that peace with you and go out. Take that mercy with you that you've received and go out and share it. Like, that's what we're called to do, is to bring the fruits of the Eucharist out into the world. The interesting thing is that these two spots are supposed to be two of the most active spots for all the laity. How often are those two spots the spots where we are most distracted? Where it's the end of Mass, and all I wanted, or it's the homily just ended, either you're thinking, that was good, that was long, that was terrible, I could do better than that, right? 1,000 things like that. If there's any young men that say, I can do better than that, enter the seminary, please. That's my plug. We're going to move on, though. Like, how many times do we sit down after the homily, though, and we just watch, kind of mindlessly watch stuff get moved on the altar? How many times is that whenever we're thinking, I wonder where we can go after Mass, I got this going on, what's my next week look like? Or what just happened before Mass, this is going. That's the spot where we're supposed to be offering up. How many times at the end of Mass, whenever the priest or the deacon says, go in peace to love and serve the Lord, whenever they come to the front of the altar, all we're doing is just waiting for them to genuflect so we can leave. We're tired of waiting. Come on, Father. He's just sitting there singing that first verse of that song that I don't like. Come on, hurry up. I need to go. I'm ready to go. Let's roll. How often is that, though, the spot where we're distracted? Those are the two spots where we come, oftentimes, they kind of hit a lull. So there's a distraction that easily works in. And those are the times where we're supposed to be most intentional. Like this is the most active moments for the lay vocation in Mass. And so often distractions come in. Like that's the spots where we got to fight the most. That's the spots where we got to reorient and refocus ourselves the most. The last spot that kind of hits on this, I think it's really fun that we got that picture because it's like every church ever. The last thing is that the liturgy is meant to be continually lived out, right? That ite missa est, the Mass is ended, go in peace. Like, get out, go. We're supposed to continually live the mysteries that we just entered into. We continually have the prayers of like calling out to God, having Him pour out, emptying ourselves before the Father in relationship, right? In our prayer. How many times do we call out to God? How many times do we ask God to purify us and pour us out? Like that's the prayers of the Mass. That's the dialogue of the Mass. How many times do we feel like we need to offer up some kind of struggle to the Lord? Or how many times do we feel like we need to go back into our family, go back into a mission territory? It's this dialogue, this coming and going, kind of like this relationship with God. It's oftentimes the way that we live out in our lives. Jean Carbone wrote a book called The Wellspring of Worship, and it's all about this living out the liturgy, by living out in the world, right? And it says, the liturgy which is celebrated at certain moments, but lived at every moment. So the liturgy is celebrated at certain moments. The Mass is celebrated at certain moments. The Liturgy of the Hours is celebrated. But it's lived at every moment. It's the one mystery of Christ who gives His life to men. When it is celebrated, it does not offer us a model that is then to be imitated for the rest of life. If this were the case, we would be back in the separation of sacred ritual from moral conduct. The Christ whom we celebrate is the identical Christ by whom we live. So like the same Jesus that's going to be right here in a little while when we have Mass is the same Jesus that we're called to witness to out there, is the same Jesus that we pray to, is the same Jesus that we open up our lives to be transformed. Oftentimes, the Jesus that's the bread, right, that looks like the bread, can seem a lot different than the Jesus that I pray to. It's the same Jesus. It's the same single mystery. So the Christ whom we celebrate is the identical Christ by whom we live. His mystery permeates both celebration and life. So when we enter into this, when we enter into the Mass, when we enter into this relationship, when we receive communion, do we let this permeate our entire life? Does this celebration of Mass, is it the thing we do on Sunday for the hour, or is it the thing we live and that fuels us for the 128, 127 in between? Like, this speaks to the lay vocation more than it speaks to many things. Are we Catholic in the church? Or are we Catholic in the culture? Is the liturgy just something that we plug into once a week and kind of get charged up? Or is it something that we live and that we stay plugged into? Like our relationship with God is called to be something that's much bigger than just our time in prayer or just our time at Mass or just our time in confession. The Christian life is meant to be something that completely permeates everything we do. Everything. Because a relationship with the Eucharist, a relationship that plugs into the Eucharist, a relationship that reverences the Eucharist is a relationship that points to Him. It's a relationship that points to Him. Like Pope Benedict, when he wrote God is Love, one of the things he said was that Jesus is not this lofty concept. Jesus is not this kind of out there kind of reality. It's not just like this abstract thing, a theory. The Christian life is the experience of a relationship with a person. Do we look at the Christian life in that way? Do we look at the Christian life as being a relationship where I become an intimate friend of Jesus Christ? Or is it something that we just kind of step back to and it's just a process? If at any point ever the Mass, becomes just a list of rules, this Catholic calisthenics of sit down, stand up, all the stuff, right? Or if the liturgy or something else, like if the stuff that we do becomes just another thing, if it just stays stuff, we need to take a step back and get back in touch with the person. If we go to Mass and we do this novena and we pray this rosary and we do this, and it becomes where we only focused on right here, all the stuff we're doing, take a step back. Keep going to Mass. But take a step back and focus back on the person. Because that's what we're called to. We're called to a relationship. We're not called to make ourselves busy with stuff. We're called to dive into a relationship with Jesus Christ. I have a tendency a lot of times to play around and joke around with people, pick every now and then, just a few, just very, very seldom I do those things. But when I do, oftentimes people will say, "Man, you act like you're like 8 years old." Somebody actually said today, they said, I was like, "Yeah, I'm like an 8-year-old in a 27-year-old's body." They said, "You're 8 years old with 19 years of experience." And I said, "Pretty much." But every time that happens, I usually, if they're like, "Wow, man, like grow up a little bit" or something, I say, "Well, God always said to be childish." And I go, "Man, it's childlike. I keep messing that up. But what do we mean by that word childlike? Like, what does he mean when he's talking about, you've hidden these things from the wise and the learned, but you have revealed them to the childlike? And then he goes on to talk about a relationship with the Father. He goes on to talk about how the Son reveals the Father, how we're invited into a relationship with the Father. This is something that we've been talking about throughout the last 6 weeks now. An intimate and active relationship with God the Father. An intimate and active relationship. A relationship that's willing to go beyond any kind of limitations. A relationship that's willing to break down any kind of limitations of transparency. Like a good priest friend of mine used this image one time of he was talking to the spiritual director, and the spiritual director told him, said, "Look, you got like all these, like your soul is like a house with all these different rooms, right? And you've got like a spot here and a spot here and this room and that room, and then like you got that one room that you don't want to go into. You got that one room that you just keep locked, and you're like, God's not going to be able to see inside that room because I'm not going to let him." And then the spiritual director looked at him and said, "But I just want to let you know, you're a house without a roof, and God's got a bird's eye view." Like, think about that image of like, what's the one spot that we're not letting God in? What's that one spot that we're holding back from him, where we can say, "I'm not being completely transparent," where I'm not being completely intimate? What's the one spot? What's that one wall? What's that one sin? What's that one vice that we don't want to give up? We don't want to let God know about? Because the freedom of this teaching, the freedom of the lay vocation comes when we're completely and totally free. And like we completely and totally freely give ourselves to God with no reservation, with no holding back, with no locked room. Active. So an intimate relationship. But then what about an active relationship? Like a child, an active relationship where we go and we run to God, we rely on God for everything. A 3-year-old can't feed themselves. They need their parents to do it. Right? A 3-year-old can't provide for themselves. They need their family to do it. How do we do that, like in our spiritual life? Are we childlike in that we ask for God to provide everything for us? Or do we try and take it upon ourselves and I'm going to do it? So often, these two spots of intimate and an active relationship with God can be hard. It can be very hard. Sometimes we feel like, man, God knows everything about me. And I'm laying out all this stuff to him. And sometimes we feel like, man, I am praying every day and I am constantly in relationship with God. And that's awesome. But it kind of hits us in cycles where, oh, I don't feel like praying right now. Or, oh, that thing happened, I'm not going to God with that. I can't go to him with that. See, in the context of the Mass, the two most active spots for the layperson, the two most engaging spots for the layperson may be the offertory and the exit. But the most active spot for God is whenever he enters into each one of our lives in a particular way. Individually, we present ourselves and receive him, body, blood, soul, and divinity. Communion is the place where our relationship with God is fed. It's where it's most active. It's where it's most intimate. So we receive a God that loves us so much that when we go back to our pews, when we go back to our seats, when we go back and we got that spot where we're just kind of like sitting there waiting for Father to say, let us pray. Like tonight, whenever you go back to that spot and you're sitting there waiting, think of this statement. Right now, in the eyes of God, the Almighty Father, you're worth dying for. One of the last things that in one of the videos that we heard was the Mass is a sacrifice. We relive the entire Paschal mystery right here. From Holy Thursday to Good Friday, the death of Christ, and to the resurrection and ascending. When we receive Christ, we receive we receive Jesus Christ. We receive a God who's willing to die for us. We receive a God who loves us that much. That's the relationship that God is pursuing us with. That's the relationship that God offers to us here tonight. That's the relationship that God offers us in every Eucharist. A relationship that he's willing to die for you right now, as you are. With every limitation that you have, every sin, every vice, every hurt that you have in your life. And God that's willing to meet you there. To be most intimate and most active in your life. Like you're worth the cross in your struggles. In your shortcomings, in your pain, you're still worth the cross. And God meets us there in the Eucharist. See, in a way, the Eucharist, the same way that the layperson is called to be the salt of the earth, to be the light in the darkness, to be the leaven of society, to be the soul, right? The same way those analogies have worked, like for the layperson in society, the Eucharist does that same thing in the darkest spots of our heart. God becomes the light. In those spots that aren't seasoned, God becomes the salt. In those spots that aren't raised up, God becomes the leaven. And in those spots that are dead, God breathes back new life. Through receiving the Eucharist, through that, God enlivens our souls. God enlivens us as Christians. He strengthens us. And ultimately, he sends us. Not for our own glorification, not for our own sake, but for his. Because we as human beings are called to worship. We're built for worship. We as the baptized are called to worship God and then to pass that on to the world. That is the lay vocation in a nutshell. To stand before God to receive him and to give him away.